Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and salam sejahtera. My name is Mohamad Omar Ihsan bin Razman, and I will be presenting our systematic review of socioeconomic factors and emotional regulation in children. As you can see here, I am the first author, followed by Dr. Manisah Muhammad Ali and Dr. Suzana Muhammad Hoesni from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Let's move on to the research background here. The review will be focusing on emotion regulation and socioeconomic factors in children. So emotion regulation, as defined by several researchers, is the ability to identify, manage, and control emotions and express them in ways that are positive and follows personal and social values. As you might know that with better emotion regulation leads to better mental health in children, as well as better social relations as they make friends in schools, better relationship with their parents and siblings at home. The reason why we focus on socioeconomic factors here is because socioeconomic factors is linked to emotional development of children. So socioeconomic factors, some of the factors are parenting style, social support, and household stress. Here is our problem statement. The reason why we think this review is important is because there's a need to critically review previous studies on emotion regulation and socioeconomic factors in children due to the increase in research on social context. As we know, currently with the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic restructuring, a lot of M40s and B40s, there's also an increased research in those areas, and we think that as there's an increase in research, we should also review previous findings in this area. The second reason is because childhood is considered a critical period for development in children, and we think it's really important to focus on this period and see how emotion regulation and socioeconomic factors develops during childhood. Here is our research objectives. The first one is to understand the role of socioeconomic status on emotion regulation in children. The second one is to identify differences in emotion regulation level of children from different socioeconomic status. Here is our research methodology. We'll be using PRISMA, which is well known for systematic literature review. The database that we'll be using that will retrieve our research papers from Web of Science and Scopus. And the focus and the area of this research will be on like socioeconomic factors, emotional regulation in children. So research related to this topic will focus on. Here are our inclusion criteria. The first one is only research with empirical data were included. So research without empirical data was excluded. Only research papers published in English were included. So other research papers in other languages were excluded. We only included research published in the past 10 years. So research from 2012 to 2021 were included. Research from 2011 and below were excluded from this review. As you can see here, after the process of identification, screening, and eligibility, only 10 research papers were included in the systematic review. Here are our findings of the review. Looking at the relationships between socioeconomic factors and emotional regulation in children. From the review, from the papers included in this review, we found a predictive, correlational, and longitudinal relationship between socioeconomic factors and emotional regulation in children. As we look deeper into the level of emotional regulation, we found that lower SES, lower socioeconomic status children scored significantly lower in terms of emotion regulation scores as compared to children from higher socioeconomic status. We also found that resilience was a protective factor in a lower socioeconomic status children. We also found that family emotional context is considered a mediator between socioeconomic factors and emotional regulation in children. Here are a few our discussion. There were several themes, several socioeconomic factors linked to emotional regulation. The first one is family income. Second is parenting or family factors. The third one is environmental factors. As we look into family income, we found that previous researchers have found that less families from lower socioeconomic status had less resources such as education, basic necessities, healthcare. They also experience more stress, and this contributes to children with lower emotional regulation scores. Parents or families from lower socioeconomic status also is affected, plays a role in terms of like parenting styles. So parenting styles are different between different social class, and that plays a role in the emotion regulation scores of their children. And parents with better emotion regulation skills had children with better emotion regulation scores as children learn these skills from their parents. The third one is on environmental factors. So children that were raised in chaotic environment, they experience cumulative stress, also significantly lower scores in terms of emotion regulation as compared to children from that were raised in a more adaptive environment. We also found that in terms of resilience, resilience was a protective factor to decrease the emotion regulation level, the buffer to decrease the emotion regulation level due to socioeconomic factors. However, as the SES becomes lower and children experience a lot more adversity in their childhood, resilience plays a smaller role to decrease, to buffer the decrease of emotion regulation level. However, due to there are several limitations to this review. The first one is only literatures that were published in English were included. So we did not retrieve information from publications in other languages. There's also a lack of studies from different countries and cultures. For example, half of the review, half of the research included in the review were from the United States, and most of the studies were conducted in developed countries as compared to developing countries and underdeveloped countries. There's also a possible publication bias, as most of the research showed a positive relationship between emotional regulation and socioeconomic factors. Here are our conclusions. In terms of implication, we find that the findings will be beneficial to organizations that work with underserved communities. It also show a need for targeted interventions in these communities, for example, social emotional learning to help children better understand their emotions and regulate their emotions. There's also a need for policy changes and fundings to provide better support to these communities. Our review contributed in terms of giving a better understanding of socioeconomic factors and emotional regulation. It also helps for us to push for policy changes and public awareness. Our recommendations are to include more studies, to have more studies done in different cultures and socioeconomic status, social context. For example, more countries from more studies from developing countries and underdeveloped countries. We also recommend for future research to study the development of emotion regulation across childhood rather than focusing on one specific age or one specific stage in childhood. We also recommend to study the role of emotion regulation skills in different age groups. That is all from us. Thank you and Assalamu alaikum.